This source material is a passionate, faith-based transcript aimed at warning the Iranian people against the potential societal and spiritual pitfalls of Western liberalism in the wake of a revolution. But the frequent use of highly specific hyperlocal American cultural references creates a disconnect that risks alienating the core Iranian audience.
Yeah, it really does.
Because from the notes we received, the intended listener here is an Iranian citizen who has just emerged from an Ayatollah-led totalitarian regime.
Right.
Yet, when we look at the text, the material leans heavily on incredibly niche American political and pop culture touchstones to make its point.
Extremely.
Yeah, like we see mentions of the American State of the Union address, the FCC, specific partisan percentage breakdowns of the United States House of Representatives and the Senate.
And the drill music artist.
Exactly. Like Ice Spice, Nipsey Hussle, Cardi B, 21 Savage, Young Thug.
So, I mean, is there a risk that focusing on these hyper-American touchstones overlooks the actual lived experience of that target audience?
Absolutely.
Because we are talking about people who, according to the text itself, have just fought a revolution, shed blood in the streets, and overthrown a decades-long theocratic regime.
Right. And when the text immediately pivots from the visceral life-and-death stakes of the Iranian Revolution to grievances about the FCC regulating American television, it's
totally jarring.
It gives the reader absolute whiplash. The disconnect here is fundamentally about context. These granular U.S.-centric political and pop culture grievances simply aren't going to resonate with an audience emerging from a vastly different geopolitical trauma.
Yeah, they just won't.
The broader, highly important warning about cultural decay ends up getting completely lost in translation.
Which is a shame, because you can really feel the author's passion. You can see they are trying to use their own lived experience and observations of American cultural shifts to map out a cautionary tale.
Right, they're using what they know.
But the bridge between the author's American context and the audience's Iranian context is missing. So to resolve this, the author needs to broaden these cultural references into universally understood concepts of societal shift, or translate these hyper-local American examples into more globally or historically recognizable cautionary tales that better serve the intended warning.
So let's look at how the author could actually pull this off. Obviously, there are an infinite number of ways to tackle this, but to give just a few concrete examples of how to implement the suggestion, let's start with a pop culture reference.
Okay.
Instead of naming the FCC and specific drill music artists, the author could discuss the universal phenomenon of how deregulated media can suddenly expose a nation's newly freed youth to the glorification of violence and apathy.
Yes, and building on that, if you strip away the names Cardi B or Nipsey Hussle, you can instead focus on the shock to the societal system.
Exactly. The structural shock.
What happens when protective, albeit restrictive barriers are removed overnight? You leave young minds vulnerable to exploitation by profit-driven media. That is a concept an Iranian reader can grasp immediately without needing to know the nuances of the Los Angeles hip-hop scene.
Yeah, they don't need the hip-hop context at all. And we can apply that exact same approach to the political references in the text. There's a whole section referencing the exact partisan makeup of the U.S. Senate, a specific 40% metric, and the State of the Union address.
Right, the 40% thing.
Yeah, so instead of all that, another concrete example would be to frame the warning around the broader historical pattern of how newly established democratic factions can sometimes use the promise of progress as a Trojan horse for ideological control.
Which maintains the exact same warning, the exact same passion, and the exact same core thesis, but it removes the barrier to entry.
It makes it accessible.
The Iranian listener no longer has to understand the intricacies of American two-party politics to grasp the warning. They just have to understand human nature and the mechanics of power, which are universal.
And when you make that adjustment, the message suddenly feels intimately tailored to them, rather than feeling like an American projecting American problems onto a Persian canvas. It respects their unique historical moment.
It really does.
And that disconnect in cultural references actually feeds right into another issue with the piece, which is how it structures its arguments. The narrative structure occasionally dilutes its primary warning by sprawling into a disparate list of unrelated cultural grievances before returning to the main.
Yeah, a key theme running through this material really seems to be the sheer volume of dangers the author sees in unchecked liberalism. But how are these dangers sequenced?
Well, the structural jumps are incredibly rapid, wide-ranging. Just to map it out within a relatively short span, the narrative moves from discussing the Iranian Revolution and Thomas Jefferson, abruptly shifts to American abortion statistics, and the Civil War pivots immediately to debates over 72 genders, and masculinity versus femininity.
And then transitions into a personal anecdote about being a quote-unquote street pharmacist.
Right, selling illegal narcotics. And then it swings all the way back to King Cyrus, the building of the Second Temple, and Persian history.
Which is a massive leap.
It's huge.
When you ask a listener to hold the historical gravity of King Cyrus, the modern internet phenomenon of OnlyFans, the philosophical writings of Karl Marx, and a personal anecdote about street pharmaceuticals in their mind all at the exact same time, cognitive overload sets in.
Total cognitive overload.
The core message, which is a very specific, targeted warning to Iran against deceptive political ideologies, gets buried under this avalanche of disconnected thoughts.
It makes the argument feel less like a cohesive driving thesis and more like a stream of consciousness list of every grievance the author has with modern society.
Yeah, like a rapid-fire venting session.
The passion is absolutely there, but the vehicle delivering that passion is swerving all over the road. When the structure sprawls like this, the audience loses the thread of the actual argument.
So how do we tighten that up?
Well, the suggestion here is to consolidate and group these scattered grievances into a single, highly focused cautionary tale section that clearly establishes a cause and effect relationship between the ideologies being criticized and their societal outcomes.
Okay, so grouping them together.
By pulling all these disparate threads into one tightly woven section, you restore the narrative momentum and keep the spotlight firmly on the main thesis.
Let's brainstorm what that might look like in practice. There are countless ways to restructure an outline, but to offer a few concrete examples of how this could be done, the author could group the points about OnlyFans, shifting gender norms, and the erosion of the traditional family unit into one tight chronological paragraph.
Right. Instead of bringing them up randomly throughout the piece, dedicate one specific section to illustrating the extremes of unchecked liberalism.
You build a micro-narrative within the text itself.
Exactly. A micro-narrative.
First, the culture shifts away from family, then media deregulates, then identity itself It becomes a staircase of logical points. The reader can walk up that staircase with you rather than feeling like they are dodging a scattershot of complaints.
You know, I was looking at the section featuring the street pharmacist anecdote, and it felt so dropped in, out of nowhere.
It really did.
But what if, and hear me out on this, what if they used it as the actual transition point? Another concrete example of the structural consolidation would be to start that specific cautionary section with the personal anecdote about the illusion of freedom in the streets.
Oh, I like that. Expand on how the freedom to sell narcotics felt like liberation to the author, but was actually a different kind of bondage, serving as an agent of darkness.
Yes, and then seamlessly pivot that personal realization into a direct parallel for the false promises of freedom the Iranian people might soon face from deceptive political actors.
Because if you don't restructure it, that anecdote just sits there as a random biographical fact.
Right.
The audience might wonder why they are suddenly reading about someone selling drugs in America when they were just reading about Thomas Jefferson.
It's confusing.
But by positioning the anecdote as the thematic hinge of the argument, it becomes a powerful metaphor. The structure then works for the author doing the heavy lifting of persuasion.
Positioning that anecdote as a thematic hinge transforms the piece from a sprawling list into a heavily calibrated warning. And that calibration is really going to be needed because the persuasive power of the argument is hindered by presenting a stark binary between theocratic oppression and total moral degeneracy, which leaves the thesis vulnerable to immediate counterarguments.
Yeah, the material does make a strong case for its warning by highlighting a very specific slippery slope, but the underlying framing operates on a strict binary.
It really does. As it reads now, if a society moves away from deep intertwined religious governance, it will inevitably plummet into drug addiction, Marxism, the eradication of gender, and the total breakdown of societal order.
It's all or nothing.
The text draws a direct, almost instantaneous line between an Iranian citizen taken off the veil and total societal destruction.
And when you frame it as an all-or-nothing choice, your reader is just going to find the exception and use it to tune you out.
Exactly.
By ignoring the existence of moderate, family-oriented democratic societies, the piece practically invites the audience to push back mentally.
Let's put ourselves in the shoes of that intended listener. They have just overthrown an authoritarian regime. They are exhausted.
Beyond exhausted.
So when they hear the stark binary, an audience member might easily dismiss the entire warning by thinking, wait a minute, we just want normal jobs, a functioning economy, and no morality police. We don't want extreme leftism or cultural Marxism. We just want to live in peace and maybe go to a cafe without fear.
And because the current draft completely ignores this massive, nuanced middle ground, it loses credibility with the very people it's trying to persuade.
It loses them completely.
If you don't acknowledge their actual desires, they will assume you simply don't understand them.
It's a critical vulnerability in any persuasive text. So the suggestion to fix this is to strengthen the robustness of the argument by proactively acknowledging and dismantling the counterargument that secular freedom can exist peacefully alongside strong personal moral frameworks.
You have to speak directly to the moderate desire before you can warn them about the extreme danger.
We need to look at how the author could execute this on the page. Again, keeping in mind that these are just a few out of all possible ways to solve the problem. One concrete example would be to insert a brief acknowledgement early on that deeply validates the audience's desire for simple, everyday freedoms.
You could explicitly state something along the lines of, I know what you are fighting for. You want the freedom to work without oppression, to express yourself, to walk down the street without fear of the morality police.
Yes.
By validating those basic, incredibly reasonable desires, you show empathy.
You do, and you ensure you aren't conflating their desire for basic human dignity with a desire for total moral decay. Once you validate them, they will drop their defenses. They will open up to hear your warning because they feel seen.
Another concrete example of implementing this suggestion is to introduce a specific voiced counter-argument directly into the text.
Right, steel manning.
Exactly. This is sometimes called steel manning your opponent's argument, bringing up the absolute strongest version of their thoughts before you dismantle. You could write something like, you might think a secular government just means you can live in peace, raise your family, and exist without a religious mandate dictating your every move. You might think that's where the revolution stops.
And once you have voiced the reader's exact thought out loud for them, you then use the subsequent paragraphs to explain why the author believes that peaceful middle ground is currently a mirage.
Right.
You explain why it is under immediate threat from opportunistic extreme political movements that leech onto democratic transitions.
You aren't changing the author's core belief that this societal decay is coming. You're just adjusting the rhetorical strategy used to present it.
Yeah, the message stays the same.
When you proactively anticipate what the reader is thinking, you neutralize their instinct to argue with you. You take their best counterargument, you put it on the table yourself, and then you dismantle it with your thesis.
It elevates the entire piece. It shifts it from a simple broadcast of personal beliefs into a masterful piece of persuasive, empathetic rhetoric that genuinely respects the intelligence and the complex desires of the Iranian people.
It really shows that you trust the audience enough to have a real conversation with them about the nuances of freedom.
But we've covered a lot of ground today unpacking the layers of this highly passionate material. To briefly summarize our actionable takeaways for the author. First, translate those highly specific, hyperlocal American references like the FCC and niche political dynamics into universally understood concepts of societal shift, which will instantly better align the text with the core Iranian audience.
Second, tighten the sprawling structure by consolidating the scattered cultural grievances into a single, cohesive, logically flowing, cautionary tale section, perhaps using the street pharmacist anecdote as a direct structural transition.
And third, strengthen the persuasive power of the piece by proactively addressing the counter-argument of moderate secularism, validating the audience's desire for simple freedoms before warning them about the ideological extremes that might follow.
The passion and the urgency in this material are absolutely its greatest asset. By applying these strategic refinements, that urgency won't just be felt, it will be clearly understood and deeply internalized by the exact audience it was meant to reach.
We highly encourage the listener to apply these structural and rhetorical adjustments to their draft. Rework the material with these concepts in mind, and please submit your revised work back in for another critique. We would love to see how this piece evolves and sharpens in its next iteration.